In frozen Minsk, in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, more than 100,000 people filled the square on January 30th, 1946, waiting for 14 condemned men. The ground was frozen hard. They were not brought there by force. They came to see the sentence with their own eyes. The Red Army had liberated Minsk on July 3, 1944, after 3 years of German occupation. Then the convoy arrived. 14 military trucks entered the square in a single column, and each flatbed carried one prisoner standing upright with a rope already around his neck. Soviet soldiers had fixed every noose before the truck stopped, so the pause came after preparation and before the pull forward. For a moment, the square of Minsk held its silence. Then the engines pulled forward, and the trucks left 14 men hanging in the winter air. The chief defendant was 55-year-old General Johann Georg Richert. His name stood first on the indictment. That case leads back to Silesia. On April 14, 1890, Richert was born in Libau in Silesia, then part of the German Empire, and now the Polish town of Lubawka. Wilhelm II had ruled that empire since 1888. In the autumn of 1909, Richert entered the Imperial Army and began officer training at military school. In March 1911, he received his lieutenant's commission, and the line of his career was already fixed inside an Imperial Army, long before the Nazi regime entered his life. 3 years later, the war he had trained for arrived. On July 28, 1914, Richert went to the front and won both classes of the Iron Cross in that first year. By 1918, Germany was losing, and after the Kaiser abdicated on November 9th, French troops captured him. He came back in 1919 after 14 months in captivity. Home was a defeated country, but Richert did not leave the army in 1919. He kept his rank of Oberleutnant, and after Versailles cut the Reichswehr to 100,000 men, he still stayed inside it. That mattered. In a force reduced that far, retention meant selection. Then the state changed around him. Hitler took power in January 1933. The Reichswehr became the Wehrmacht in 1935, and by mid-1938, Richert had reached Oberst. In February 1939, he took command of the 23rd Infantry Regiment of the 11th Infantry Division. That new command met war almost at once. Only 6 months later, on September 1, 1939, Richert led the 23rd Infantry Regiment of the 11th Infantry Division into Poland. Warsaw fell within weeks. His regiment entered the campaign from the first day. The next test came in May 1940. German forces crossed the Ardennes, skirting the Maginot Line, which ran for about 450 kilometers, and French commanders had treated that sector as poor ground for a major armored attack. Paris fell within 6 weeks. Richert fought in both campaigns and received decorations in both. By the summer of 1941, on paper, he looked seasoned, dependable, and loyal. That record carried him toward June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa began before dawn on June 22, 1941, when 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, Slovak, and Croatian units supported them along a front almost 3,060 kilometers wide. Army Group Center drove through Belarus toward Minsk, then Smolensk and Moscow. This was no ordinary campaign. Nazi ideologues defined it as a racial war against Jews, Slavs, and Communists, people the regime had already marked for destruction. Pre-war Belarus stood among the largest centers of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. German forces took Minsk within 7 days, and the shootings started that same week. The fall of Minsk turned conquest into policy within days. In July 1941, the occupiers created the Minsk Ghetto, one of the largest on occupied Soviet territory. Jews were pushed into overcrowded quarters, cut off from food and medicine, and left to starve. The pattern was clear. The same policy reached beyond the ghetto. Slavic civilians, including farmers, teachers, factory workers, and whole families, were marked for destruction under Nazi racial policy. Mass shootings began almost at once. Villages burned. Einsatzgruppen followed the Wehrmacht into Soviet territory and shot civilians in ditches as whole communities disappeared. In Belarus, the occupation killed about 1/3 of the pre-war population. That was the ground. Richard entered it in the summer of 1941 with his regiment. By December 1941, his rise already had a clear shape. Richard received the German Cross in Gold for exceptional combat performance, a decoration placed between the Iron Cross First Class and the Knight's Cross. 4 months later, in April 1942, the Army promoted him to Major General and gave him the 286th Security Division in the Orsha region of northern Belarus. Orsha mattered. It was a rail hub on the Minsk-Smolensk line, and rear area units there guarded tracks, depots, and prisoner of war camps while crushing resistance behind the front. On paper, that still sounded military. In practice, security duty meant burned villages, shot hostages, and deported civilians. Post-war testimony and Soviet investigation files describe more than failure to stop these crimes. They describe Richard encouraging them himself. At Orsha, his approval became a direct road order. Women went first, children too. Richard drove local civilians onto roads and paths he suspected were mined, making them walk ahead, pull a plow, or drag army gear so his soldiers would not go first. In one village of the Orsha district, 28 people died. 18 were children. No separate order from above appears in this episode. The choice came from the division commander himself. In late December 1942, his division opened the 4-week Operation Winter Forest. What began on one road now covered a whole district. Soviet files and post-war German records describe the same result. Both archives agree. German forces killed 1,627 Belarusian civilians. They sent 2,041 people to forced labor. They also took about 8,000 head of livestock and more than 167,000 meat rations from villages already near hunger. Whole villages disappeared. The paper trail matters. Richert signed the orders and read the reports that returned to headquarters. After his division passed, winter villages held dead residents, missing workers, empty barns, and stripped food stores. In November 1943, he moved to the 35th Infantry Division. By March 1944, he received the Ozarichi order. The transfer changed the method, not the target. In March 1944, Richert received an order tied to General Joseph Harp's plan for the 9th Army. It called for a holding site for Soviet civilians the Germans no longer wanted to feed or keep, especially the sick, the elderly, and children unfit for work. The place stood near Ozarichi, about 140 kilometers southeast of Minsk, in open marshland at the end of winter. There were no buildings on that ground. No barracks, no roofs, no sanitation, and no food stores. The camp was an enclosed tract with barbed wire, watchtowers, guards, and German shepherd dogs around the perimeter. Soldiers from Richert's 35th Infantry Division, backed by Sonderkommando 7B of Einsatzgruppe B, began driving columns from nearby villages and small towns toward the wire near Ozarichi. That roundup made the target plain. The columns held children under 13, nursing mothers, the sick, the elderly, and relatives of men already sent to forced labor in Germany. These were civilians, not armed units, and many already carried typhus spread by lice. Guards shot at least 500 people on the march when they collapsed or fell behind. Post-war 9th Army papers show the commanders knew the toll. The killing appeared in their own correspondence. They proposed burial crews for later roundups, so those crews would clear bodies from the road to Ozarichi. That road ended in a marsh camp. German units drove the deportees behind wire at Ozarichi, set up in Belarus in March 1944, with no barracks at all. No barracks, no fire. The German High Command feared that smoke would mark their position for the advancing Red Army, so guards shot people who tried to light fires and people who reached the fence for water. Larisa Stashkevich later described a gate, barbed wire, watchtowers, soldiers, dogs, and nothing else. Only wire, towers, dogs, guards. To keep warm, she pressed her body against the bodies of the dead. German papers recorded the deaths and labeled the victims' useless mouths in internal correspondence. Later historians placed Ozarichi among the Wehrmacht's worst crimes. In 1 week alone, at least 9,000 people died inside the camp. A few months later, the front rolled west. In summer 1944, the Soviet Union opened Operation Bagration on June 23rd. Within weeks, the Red Army destroyed 28 of Army Group Center's 34 divisions, and Minsk was liberated on July 3rd. Richard's 35th Infantry Division took heavy losses and fell back toward East Prussia. In the war's final weeks, Soviet forces encircled it near Gdansk. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered without conditions. That same day, Johann Georg Richert laid down his arms and surrendered to Soviet forces. That surrender placed Richard in Soviet custody, and Soviet investigators moved quickly. In December 1945, Soviet guards brought him into the Minsk war crimes trial, a Soviet military tribunal where he stood as the lead defendant. 18 accused men faced the court. On December 15th, interrogators questioned him from 9 in the evening until 2 in the morning, and he chose to cooperate. He admitted guilt, then shifted responsibility upward and said he had only followed orders. In his final statement, he asked for mercy, declared a break with Nazism, and tried to recast himself as an anti-fascist. The judges rejected that appeal. On January 29, 1946, the tribunal found him guilty on every count and sentenced him, along with 13 others, to death by hanging. When the judges read the verdict, everyone in the courtroom stood. By morning, the written sentence had left the courtroom. It now moved into open view at the Minsk horse racing ground, the site connected today with Victory Square, where the Ozarichi case became a public display of punishment. More than 100,000 civilians came to watch. 14 military trucks entered the square. On the back of each one stood one condemned man, with the noose already around his neck. The crowd did not cheer. It stayed silent while Soviet soldiers finished the last preparations beside the trucks and under the ropes. Eyewitnesses remembered 2 different kinds of final seconds. Some of the condemned men stood rigid and tried to keep their composure, while others lost control before the vehicles moved. No one interrupted the silence. The square just waited. Richard stood among them at 55 years old. By then, he had spent 36 years in uniform, through 2 world wars, through the rise of Nazism, and through the occupation of half of Europe. That record ended here. Not at headquarters, not under cross-examination. Each truck carried 1 man and 1 sentence. Soldiers stepped back. The drivers took their cue, and the pause before movement lasted only a moment longer. Then the truck started. On January 30, 1946, 14 military trucks moved across Minsk, and the sentence was carried out before a crowd of more than 100,000 people.